What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
So in my mind, Batman and Superman are like the 1-2 punch of the comic book industry. I mean, it'll always be that way. You know, they were the original two when the comic book industry first began to emerge back in the 1930s, and they'll always be the top two. No matter what happens, you know, come what may, people will always remember Batman and Superman. They've both been teammates, they've been friends, they've been enemies, they've fought, they've worked together. There's been virtually every single conceivable situation involving the two of them in some form or fashion. It's always been published by DC Comics. And so it makes sense that at some point along the line, DC would do a story where Superman became Batman. Now, this came out in 1993 by a guy named J.M.D. Mateus, and Mateus always has good stuff. I mean, he always has, you know, good writing, regardless of what it happens to be. The cool thing about this, though, is it takes the concept of Batman and it turns it on its head. So initially, a lot of this starts out much in the same way that Superman's origin normally does, because in virtually every circumstance, regardless of what it is, when it comes to a retelling of Superman in a different circumstance, where he's a bad guy, where he's a Russian, like we saw in Superman Red Son, his origin story always stays the same in the sense that he was sent away from Krypton as it was dying. But in this circumstance, in this story, he actually ends up crash landing on Earth, and he's discovered by Thomas and Martha Wayne. Now, what's interesting about this is that they're actually on their way to a governor's dinner, I think it is, and of course they have Alfred driving them. But when they find this baby, they basically adopt it, and they end up going back home. And so what we're told, and again, this is really told from the perspective of Lois Lane, and we'll find out how she fits in later on in the story. But what we're told is that in the early days of really Superman's life, you know, when he was raised by the Waynes, of course, he was named Bruce. His mother doted over him in every form or fashion. I mean, she gave him pretty much everything he needed to grow up with a happy childhood, toys and so on and so forth. But his father, Thomas Wayne, focused a lot on his intellect to make sure that he was sharp as a whip, to make sure that he was extremely intelligent, and his ability to navigate through different circumstances, because again, they both represent two sides of the same coin. You know, if Martha Wayne is focusing on creativity and, you know, drive for success, then Thomas Wayne's focusing on the tools that Superman will need to achieve that success. The problem with this is that as he grew up in such a reclusive manner, he didn't really have a lot of contact with people outside of Wayne Manor. So because of this, he really became attached to Alfred in the sense that Alfred was very much a father figure for him whenever his father wasn't around. And this is really how things worked with Bruce Wayne in a lot of different ways. You know, Bruce Wayne looked to Alfred as a father figure when his father died. And Alfred very much took up this mantle and raised Bruce Wayne, you know, as his own son, because it's what Bruce needed. With regards to Superman, we also have a circumstance where he sees his parents passing. Now, this is really cool. This is what I like so much, because for me, like, I always wish that Joe Chill had just been killed. Like, I always wish that Batman had just like killed him, because I felt like he had it coming. And in this story, J.M.D. Mateus really invokes emotions of hatred for Joe Chill with regards to how Superman views him. And this is really important because J.M.D. Mateus is really good at crafting stories, at crafting character development in a way to where we really begin to see the world through their eyes, and we really begin to feel the same kind of emotions they do. And so when Joe Chill runs up on the family of Superman, when he runs up on Thomas and Martha Wayne, the situation unfolds much the same way it did before, in the sense that they're basically being robbed, you know, they're both shot, they're both killed. But instead of the Batman scenario where Bruce Wayne's just sitting there crying and left to deal with his parents' death, Superman lashes out, and in fact his heat vision emerges, and he actually kills Joe Chill with his heat vision. And this is so awesome to me, because, you know, I always imagine seeing something like this happen. Like, I always imagine Bruce Wayne just lashing out and just like beating Joe Chill to death or something like that. But seeing Superman able to do this, seeing his powers manifest this way, is a totally different thing. Now, this is starkly different from the main Superman stories, the main Superman mythos, regardless of how his origin's being told, when it comes to the Kent family. And the reason why is because they raised him to know the difference between right and wrong. They raised him with a mindset that he would never have done something like this. And not only that, when his powers began to manifest, they began to manifest in a relatively controlled environment. It wasn't in the middle of a murder like we saw here. Instead, it was, you know, whether it was on the farm, whether it was him, you know, experiencing his powers when he was at school, you know, different stories have depicted it different ways, but it's always been a sort of him coming to an understanding about his powers by way of the Kents, as opposed to being left to his own devices to figure it out. And that's really the way this works. Now, what Mateus also does is he kind of jumps forward a little bit. He really fast tracks the passage of time. But one of the more important things he does here is he does not have Superman use his abilities. Instead, Superman in the early days of his life tried to be a regular person. Not only that, he stayed very reclusive. And in fact, Alfred said, look, you got to go out and you got to do something. You got to go out there. I mean, sure, we got the some money coming in from Wayne Enterprises, but you got to go out and have a life. You got to go have adventure. You know, you're 21 years old. You got to go out and experience things. But for Superman, he didn't want to have anything to do with any of that stuff. Instead, what he would do is he would cut out the various snippets from newspaper articles about the world going to pot, about Gotham City, you know, going to pieces, and he would basically hang them up. Now, we don't really know why he does this. And in fact, the narrative of Lois Lane tells us he doesn't even know why he does this. But the notion or the idea seems to be that if Superman can effectively focus on the pain of others, then he can block his own pain. He can keep his own powers at bay. He can stay away. But because of the fact that his powers will manifest periodically, his super hearing, his super seeing, or his supervision, or whatever the case may be, he'll try to keep them blocked as best he can, but sometimes they'll become overpowering. In this instance, he actually hears several guys breaking into Wayne Manor for the purpose of robbing it. Now, what's also cool about this is that as he goes through and begins to pummel each one of these guys, he also begins to see Joe Chill. And this is really Mateus telling us that for Superman, Joe Chill haunts his every waking dream, his every sleeping nightmare. It's in his mind 24 hours a day. That's all he ever thinks about. Why he maintains that thought process is something that we don't really know, but we do know that with him holding on to his anger the way he does, where he initially had the opportunity to kill some of these guys, he actually didn't. He ended up letting them go, throwing him out the window, and they went about their way. But it's also Alfred being shocked and appalled by what it is that he sees, with Superman, you know, lashing out in such a way. Now, the other thing that we learn is that Superman had very much repressed all those memories of his parents dying. We didn't initially know that. Instead, we thought it was him just kind of coping with his grief as best he could, but he actually blocked those memories out. But by letting his emotions get the better of him, even if it was only for a temporary amount of time, he ends up recalling everything. And in his mind, he has much the same existential crisis that Bruce Wayne had when he said, well, you know, I could have saved them. I could have saved their lives. I could have kept them alive if I'd known how to use my power. And so the question he has is, where do I come from? What am I? You know, why do I have these abilities? Now, again, this runs almost parallel with the traditional Superman origin, because that's the same question he asked the Kents. Who am I? Where am I from? Why am I here? Why can I do things like run, you know, super fast? Why can I jump really far? Why am I floating in the air? You know, why do I have heat vision? Why can I hear everything around me, even the things that I shouldn't be able to hear? And so Alfred effectively takes him down into what would normally be the Batcave and provides him with the journals of Thomas Wayne, who had effectively written down everything that he had seen in relation to his son since the day they first discovered him up until the day of his death. And he basically comes to the realization that he had just arrived on Earth. No one knew how he got here. No one knew where he came from. He was just here one day, and, you know, the Waynes adopted him as their own. And so much like Bruce Wayne, when he, you know, looked to the bats as a signal from his father as to who it is that he was supposed to become, the Superman looks to the bats. But the difference here is that instead of considering it a symbol from Thomas Wayne, yes, I will become fear in the hearts and minds of everybody out there, he looks at the fact that he can fly, and he sees the bats that can fly, and he says, well, I'm supposed to be like them. And so in effect, he makes himself Batman, a creature of the night that can terrify people because he can dress in a way that will inspire fear in virtually all of them. And so what we do is we end up transitioning to about 2 months later, and we pick up with a guy named Mick Johnson. Now, Mick Johnson is not extremely important here, but he's only important insofar as the fact that this is really like the first major act of Superman as Batman. Now, the cool thing about this is one of the things that I enjoy, is that of course he is flying around. I mean, he's got his super hearing, he's got his heat vision, you know, he's got X-ray vision, and he has all the traditional powers that Superman has. His durability, you know, effectively being bulletproof from conventional weapons. But instead of being like Batman, where he tries to get innocent people back to the way they were, or he tries to help out people, instead, he actually threatens to throw Mick Johnson off the building, and then he does. Then he simply just throws him off there. Now, again, this is all coming from the perspective of Lois Lane, and that's why this works, because some of the things that we get here sort of just require us to delve into hearsay and to speculation at best. And that's a lot of what happens. You know, she says, according to the cops, he was on the roof one minute, and the next minute he was falling down, and no one really knew what happened to him. But he says, you know, Batman effectively threw him off. But this is really just Superman creating a kind of a name for himself, saying, here's who I am, here's what I'm about. You know, I'm a no-nonsense guy. I'm effectively going to deal with criminals one way or the other. Either they're going to die or they're going to go to jail, but they're going to pay for their actions. Now, again, this is very different from the traditional Batman in the sense that the traditional Batman has a rule, no killing. The no-kill rule has been a part of Batman's mythos for decades. It was not originally part of his mythos, but it became part of his mythos. And because of that, he has the rule that you don't kill anybody. That was one of the biggest reasons why in DC Rebirth, there was so much contention between Dick Grayson, Raptor, and Batman, in the sense that Batman always taught Dick Grayson, you don't kill, but Raptor said, hey man, sometimes it's okay to kill. You know, that's why it creates that really interesting scenario in the Rebirth event as it stands right now. But, you know, transitioning over to Wayne Enterprises, what we also learn is that Lex Luthor has traveled from Metropolis to Gotham City. Now, he had effectively corrupted Metropolis. We'll learn more about that later on, but this is really just Mateus saying, hey guys, here's the traditional roster of Superman as you know it. You know, Perry White, Lex Luthor, Lois Lane, they're all going to be coming over here. They're all going to be part of this story, but they're gonna be operating out of Gotham City. Now, the cool thing about this is that when it comes to characters that we know historically in comic books, it's always good to see like a different take on them. It's always good to see them in roles that they wouldn't normally be in. And of course, having them operating out of Gotham City is actually cool because it's not a huge difference. I mean, things are pretty much the way they were before when they were in Metropolis, but the namesake changing, putting them in a new location, it seems like it changes everything. It gives that feeling that things are totally different, radically different from the way that they're supposed to be. Now, with Superman getting in here, you know, of course, as, you know, Bruce Wayne, well, of course, that was the name that was given to him when he was adopted by the Waynes. You know, he says, yes, I've been reclusive. You know, yes, I have been hidden away from the world, but I'm back now. Not only that, Lex Luthor had been sitting at this board of all these different conglomerates and said, hey, look, I'm effectively buying out Wayne Enterprises. That's what's happening here. Like, I will be running Wayne Enterprises. Bruce Wayne will continue to make money just because of the fact that he's, you know, technically the inheritor and it's in the will that it can't be, you know, revoked. His trust fund can't be taken away, you know, but I'm effectively going to be the one running the show. With Bruce Wayne showing up here, he says, no, you're not. You know, I do not authorize this. I'm gonna be involved in day-to-day operations. I'm not leaving this to be whatever, you know, this company to just kind of become whatever it ends up becoming. You know, it's my father's legacy. I'm going to uphold my father's legacy, and I'm gonna treat it with the kind of respect that he deserves. Now, of course, we know that this strikes a chord in Lex Luthor, and we know that Lex Luthor is effectively going to be an enemy of Superman in Gotham City with no uncertain terms. I mean, that's a guaranteed thing. There's never really been an instance when Superman and Lex Luthor were allies. They've almost always been enemies. The only exception to that is if you took like an alternate reality Lex Luthor from Earth 3, like we saw in Crisis on Infinite Earths, and they ended up working together, or where you have Rebirth right now, where it's more or less a reformed Lex Luthor, but even then, they still don't fully trust him. But in some form or fashion, they've always been on opposite ends of the moral compass, and I like that because I think that historically, Superman and Lex Luthor should always be villains. I mean, they really shouldn't be friends. It's cool for temporary storytelling, but for the long haul, the status quo, I think, should be maintained. But again, that's just kind of personal opinion. I'm always down for something cool. So that's one of the reasons why I love Superman and DC Rebirth right now, because it's a whole different kettle of beans, but I digress. Back to the topic at hand. With Superman effectively acting in such a capacity in Gotham City to work within the confines of Wayne Enterprises as well as better the city itself, what he had done is he had gone to the Daily Planet and he had basically bought up all the best people who were there. So he bought Lois Lane, he bought up Harry White, he brought them all over. Now, I guess buying isn't really the best term, but he'd offer them better jobs, more or less. Now, with Lois Lane getting here again, this is basically a return to the Clark Kent aspect that we know, in the sense that to the public eye, you know, this is Bruce Wayne, but he takes a very Clark Kent approach in being bumbling, kind of a buffoon, a little bit adorable, you know, the charming kind of guy that Lois Lane, you know, eventually fell in love with when it came to the Superman mythos. Not only that, you know, because so much of this is told by Lois Lane, we also get a little bit of backstory here in the sense that in Metropolis, Lex Luthor had basically bought the Daily Planet and he had fired Perry White, and then he turned the Daily Planet into a news agency that would effectively write puff pieces about him all the time. So nobody would really have any reason to question the legitimacy of his actions. Now, again, this is very different from the traditional DC landscape where the Daily Planet doesn't really work against Lex Luthor so much as it does not oppose the idea of its reporters, namely Lois Lane, writing the truth about Lex Luthor. If he does something bad, Lois Lane will publish it. If he does something good, Lois Lane will publish it. She always goes after the truth, whatever that truth happens to be. Now, because of this, because of the fact that Lois Lane had been part of the Daily Planet, because Lex Luthor doesn't know who she is, he says a couple things here. One of the things he says is that he really wants to have her around. I mean, he still finds her very attractive physically, but not only that, there was also a chemical incident that had taken place in Metropolis with one of his chemical factories being destroyed or blowing up and Lex Luthor almost dying. And so because of this, you know, his arrival here in Gotham, as he says, has effectively made him a new man. It's given him a chance to turn over a new leaf and try something new. And so while he does make a pass at Lois Lane, she ultimately turns him down and then he throws her out of the car, which is actually really screwed up. Now, enter Batman, or I guess, you know, Superman Batman meeting Lois Lane for the very first time. And this is cool to me because this gives Lois Lane a chance to actually meet the superhero that she would traditionally know as Superman, but instead is actually Batman. Of course, when she's kicked out, we would expect that she'd be kicked out in a very nefarious place. Now, this is just the quintessential example of Lois Lane. I mean, Lois Lane is the first lady of comics. You know, she is the original damsel in distress when it comes to comic books. And so we knew that somewhere along the line, she was going to be taken prisoner, or she was going to be held captive, or she was somehow going to be in danger from someone somewhere. And then Superman Superman would fly in and rescue her. I guess Batman in this instance would fly in and rescue her. This is exactly what happens. You know, being thrown out of the vehicle, she's set upon by several gangsters or several criminals who, of course, intend to do physically violent things with her. And then Batman steps in. Now, you know, while they try to stab him, while they try to injure him as best they can, you know, of course, he's bulletproof. So really nothing they do works. Not only that, as Lois Lane watches this unfold, she's not enamored. We would expect her to be, you know, enthralled, to be amazed. Yeah, this guy, Superman, you know, what a hunk. Like we would expect that kind of a reaction. She's horrified by what she sees. She's terrified by what she sees. And the reason why is because he's a very selfish person in her eyes. And this is really, really cool. This is what I love about Mateus's writing with this, because the Superman is very selfless. You know, Superman will put the lives of others above his own. Hence the death of Superman. He sacrificed his life to protect the city of Metropolis and really the world from the onslaught of Doomsday. The way he fought on behalf of other people, the way he fought, you know, for those he loved was always very selfless. It wasn't him fighting for his own reasons. It was him fighting for other reasons. Now, this really allows us to put into view the nature of Batman himself, the nature of Bruce Wayne, because Bruce Wayne is a very selfish person. When it comes down to it, the reason why he became Batman was because his parents were killed. It's just a desire to basically satisfy his own need for justice as well as protect other people. Now, over the course of his life, Bruce Wayne's motivations have changed to where it's evolved to the point where he's a superhero that wants to make sure that justice is served, but it doesn't change the fact that the very essence of who Batman is rooted, or at least who Batman traditionally is rooted in selfishness, his desire to see Joe Chill pay. With Mateus writing this story where Superman becomes Batman, it throws that in our face. It says, yeah, this is who Batman is. Batman's a selfish guy, guys. Like, he's not a caring person. He's not, you know, emotionally accessible. You know, he's not a guy that wears his heart on his sleeve. You know, he's a very dark, very distant, very cruel person in a lot of different ways. And to see these two dichotomies merge together works extremely well. Now, with regards to Lois Lane herself, of course, she's continuing to write pieces about Batman, so on and so forth. And again, this is very different because instead of celebrating the nature of Batman, she's talking about how dangerous he is, about how he's really more of a danger to the city than even Lex Luthor himself. But then she's also met with Bruce Wayne, speaking with her directly. And of course, this unfolds exactly the way the Clark Kent Lois Lane dichotomy sort of came together, in the sense that they end up kissing, you know, they end up coming together, and they're, you know, I guess we assume they're kind of with each other, you know, they end up touching naughty bits at some point along the line. But we also find out the truth behind Lex Luthor. And this is actually something that I really, really enjoyed. Lex Luthor is effectively the Joker. How it is that he became the Joker is pretty obvious by now, in the sense that the chemical explosion, you know, ended up, you know, scarring him, disfiguring him in the extreme. His doctors tried to put him back together again, but couldn't quite pull it off. And so because of that, he looked at who he is now as the Joker and said, well, this is my chance to start over again. Hence the reason he moved to Gotham City, was to basically take the city over as best he could. Now, in terms of him being the Joker, this is really Mateus doing a total 180 with Lex Luthor. I like the idea of Lex Luthor being the Joker. I think that on paper it works. In terms of execution, I'm not 100% sure it does, because the Joker is, by his very definition, insane. The Joker is an insane human being. Sometimes the Joker doesn't even know the reasons behind his own schemes. He just does it because it makes sense. Sometimes we get Steve Englehart Joker, where he says, you know what, my grand scheme is going to be to make fish look like me and then copyright them. Like, that's the whole point of Joker's scheme, is to make money on copywriting fish that he's poisoned to look like himself. That's the kind of crazy, insane things that Joker does. Now, that's traditional. That's pre-New 52 Joker. This is 1993, so this is pre-New 52 as well. But, you know, Scott Snyder's Joker was much darker, far more sinister, which I loved. That version of the Joker, by the way, the Pale Man mythos and all that kind of stuff, was Scott Snyder, I think, at his absolute best, really at his peak when it came to writing. But, you know, having Lex Luthor being the Joker, having someone who is insanely smart, or believed to be insanely smart, suddenly becoming the Joker, it doesn't quite seem to mesh in terms of personalities. And even now, you know, he cracks a few jokes here and there, but he seems very sane for a villain that's historically been absolutely insane, regardless of what timeline or what story has been told about him. Now, what he also says here is that his mission was to effectively take over the city of Gotham. We didn't really know exactly how it was he intended to do that. Instead, Batman actually shows up, and of course, Batman fights against Joker for a time, and then we learn the truth. We learn that what had happened was, behind the scenes, Lex Luthor had basically bought an army. He had brought in a paramilitary army with tanks, soldiers, rockets, the whole 9 yards, and intended to basically raze Gotham City to the ground and then rebuild it in his own image, which would have been the nation state of Jokerania, which is kind of a weird name. But the idea was to effectively destroy everything as it stood here. And so, you know, with Batman dealing with the Joker, essentially throwing him into prison and not really killing him, at the end of the day, what he does is he begins going through and basically tearing apart all these guys. Now, the initial reaction of Batman was to kill the Joker. That was the initial reaction, and it would have traumatized Lois Lane to see that, because she would have felt horrible if he had, because he's capable of so much better. And that's really the view of Lois Lane, you know, with regards to him in the story, is you're capable of so much better, why don't you do better? You know, I mean, if you're able to do it, why don't you do it? You know, if you're able to be a beacon for hope, then why don't you become a beacon for hope? Why do you stay this dark and sinister being that feeds on fear? And so as Batman goes through and defeats every last one of these guys, this is exactly what Lois Lane tells him. She says, you know, you have so much power. You are unbridled power. Bullets bounce off of you. You have heat vision. You can hear people who are screaming for help on the other side of the planet. You can fly. I mean, you're a person that could lead humanity into a better tomorrow. Be that person. Be that person that will lead humanity into a greater day. And that's exactly what he does. Ultimately, at the end of the story, Bruce Wayne effectively casts off the Batman mantle, and instead, he essentially becomes the Superman as we know him. Now, of course, his outfit's a little bit different, but in terms of what he stands for, in terms of who he is, this is basically Superman, the Superman that we all know and that we all love. But with that being said, if you guys are new here to Comics Explained, then hit the subscribe button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like and leave a comment down below. Let me know what you thought about Speeding Bullets, because this is actually a pretty solid story, and I will catch you all later. Peace.